She fell from the top of a palace. Her body hit the ground with enough force to splash blood on the walls and on the horses. Jehu rode over her with his chariot and went inside to eat. When they were sent to bury her, the servants found only 3 pieces. The dogs had already taken the rest. This is the story of how a queen came to that end, and why every detail had been foreseen with unsettling precision decades before. To understand what happened in Jezreel that day, you need to go back about 40 years before the end. Because Jezebel was not an accident of history. She was a deliberate, political, calculated choice, and the effects of that choice swept through entire generations of Israel with the force of an avalanche that no one managed to stop in time. It all begins in the reign of Omri. Ahab's father was a general who had come to the throne of Israel in the most violent way possible, by coup. Omri was competent, pragmatic, and understood something that few kings of Israel had understood before him, that the political survival of a small, fragile kingdom in the ancient Middle East depended on external alliances, not on faith, not on obedience, on alliances. And the most advantageous alliance available at the time was with Phoenicia, the coastal corridor dominated by commercial city-states whose ships reached the entire Mediterranean: Byblos, Tyre, Sidon. They were merchant powers that controlled trade routes: Lebanese cedar, glass, purple dye, ivory. Whoever allied with them gained access to a network of wealth that Israel, a land without strategic coastline, could never achieve on its own. The alliance was sealed in the most common way of antiquity, by marriage. Ahab, son and heir of Omri, married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of Sidon and priest of Baal. The father's name already tells you everything you need to know. Ethbaal literally means with Baal, or on behalf of Baal. He was not merely a king who tolerated the worship of Baal. He was a priest of the deity. And the daughter he sent to Israel carried all of this with her, not as secondary cultural baggage, but as a central identity, as a mission. Jezebel did not come to Israel to adapt. She came to transform. Baal was the deity of fertility and storm in the Canaanite pantheon. His worship involved agrarian rituals tied to the seasons, ceremonies at the so-called high places, sacred platforms built on hilltops, and in some traditions, practices that the Mosaic law categorized as abomination. Baal's theology was the antithesis of Yahweh's theology, not only in terms of divine identity, but in terms of structure. Where Yahweh demanded exclusivity, Baal was compatible with other gods. Where Yahweh established codified moral and social law, the worship of Baal was essentially instrumental. You served him to obtain rain, harvest, fertility. It was transactional religion, and that flexibility made the substitution much easier to sell to a people who had already fragmented religiously and politically. Jezebel did not need to convince Israel that Baal was better than Yahweh. She only needed to create enough structure so that the alternative practice was more accessible, more supported, and safer than fidelity to the Old Covenant. The biblical record in 1 Kings, chapter 16, verses 31 through 33, is direct. Ahab took Jezebel as his wife, went to serve Baal, and bowed down before him. He built a temple for Baal in Samaria. He also made a sacred pole dedicated to the goddess Asherah. The text says that Ahab did more to provoke the God of Israel than all the kings who preceded him. But it would be imprecise to attribute this solely to Ahab, because Ahab had weaknesses, had ambivalences, had moments of retreat. Jezebel had none of these. She was ideologically committed in a way that her husband never was, and that imbalance of convictions between the two shaped every political decision of their 22 years of joint reign. Put into perspective what this represented for Israel at that moment. The northern kingdom had been separated from Jerusalem and the temple for nearly a century. The Levitical priests had migrated to Judah en masse when Jeroboam installed the golden calves. The worship of Yahweh was compromised, dispersed, weakened. The arrival of a Phoenician queen with resources, determination, and institutional religious connections was like throwing fuel on embers that were already glowing. In a short time, the worship of Baal went from a tolerated private practice to a state religion, with royal funding and political protection. 450 prophets of Baal came to be sustained at the queen's table. 400 prophets of Asherah as well. 850 men fed with palace resources to propagate the theology Jezebel had brought from Sidon. This was not casual syncretism. It was a systematic program of religious substitution. And at the same time, she funded the expansion of Baal worship. Jezebel methodically persecuted the prophets of Yahweh. The text of 1 Kings chapter 18 says she killed them. The Hebrew verb used implies organized extermination, not episodic. Obadiah, steward of Ahab's palace, hid 100 prophets in 2 caves, 50 in each, and fed them bread and water in secret so they would not be found. That gives you the scale of the persecution. This was not a symbolic purge. It was systematic hunting of men who represented the religious memory of Israel. And it was in this context that Elijah appeared. The prophet from Tishbe was everything Jezebel could not tolerate. A man from the countryside, without political connections, without priestly position, without institutional structure, who nonetheless had the audacity to present himself to the king and announce drought. Not plead, not negotiate, announce. 1 Kings chapter 17 verse 1. As the Lord God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word. 3.5 years of drought followed. The ancient Middle East was vulnerable to drought in a way that modern populations can hardly fathom. Without rain, the pastures dry up. Without pasture, the livestock dies. Without livestock, there is no meat, no milk, no leather. The grains also fail. The famine that sets in is slow, progressive, and democratic. It strikes the poor and the rich in sequence, reaches the palace more slowly, but it reaches it. And when it reaches the palace, the authority of those who govern begins to bleed along with it. When Elijah returned in the 3rd year with instructions to summon the 850 prophets of Baal and Asherah to Mount Carmel, King Ahab went. The drought had corroded any basis of authority those prophets could invoke to refuse. The people were there. Reality was there. And Elijah's proposal was simple. 2 altars, 2 bulls, no fire. The God who answered with fire from heaven would be recognized as the true one. What happened on Mount Carmel in 1 Kings chapter 18 is one of the most dramatically constructed scenes in all of biblical narrative. The 450 prophets of Baal cried out from morning until noon. They danced around the altar. They cut themselves with knives and spears until blood flowed. Elijah publicly mocked them. He suggested that Baal was perhaps sleeping or traveling or too busy to listen. By evening, after hours of fruitless ritual, nothing had answered. Then Elijah repaired the altar of Yahweh that had been dismantled. He used 12 stones, 1 for each tribe of Israel. He dug a trench around it. He ordered 12 jars of water to be poured over the sacrifice 3 times in the midst of a drought, a calculated waste, a demonstration of confidence. And then he prayed once in a few sentences. Fire came down and consumed the burnt offering, the stones, the dirt, and the water in the trench. The people who had remained silent throughout that entire day fell prostrate and declared, "The Lord, He is God." The prophets of Baal were executed at the brook Kishon, 450 men. When the news reached Jezebel, She did not back down. She sent a messenger to Elijah with a direct and precise threat. "May the gods do so to me and more, if by this time tomorrow I have not made your life like the life of one of them." The coldness of the sentence is disturbing precisely because it is not impulsive anger. It is a calculated threat, delivered in writing, with a defined deadline. Jezebel knew she could not recover the 450 prophets killed at Carmel, but she could signal that her authority had not been broken, that she still controlled the fate of those who opposed her. And it worked. Elijah ran into the desert, exhausted and afraid, and asked for his own death under a broom tree. The prophet who had confronted a king and challenged 850 priests was brought down by a written message with a 24-hour deadline. That tells you something about the specific nature of Jezebel's power. She understood the psychological power of terror with a precision that few leaders of the ancient world mastered. She did not need to kill all her enemies. She needed all her enemies to believe that she was capable of doing so at any moment, without hesitation, without consequence. But the most revealing episode of her entire trajectory is not Mount Carmel. It is Naboth. Naboth was a man from Jezreel who owned a vineyard adjacent to Ahab's palace in that city. Ahab wanted the vineyard for a vegetable garden, according to the text of 1 Kings chapter 21 itself. He offered money or a better vineyard in exchange. Naboth refused, not out of stubbornness, but for a clear theological reason. The Mosaic law prohibited the permanent alienation of hereditary tribal property. The land belonged to the family and the lineage, not to the individual who temporarily occupied it. Naboth's response was an implicit citation of that law. "The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers." It was not obstinacy. It was fidelity to the legal structure that regulated property in Israel. Ahab went home dejected, lay on his bed with his face turned to the wall, and refused food. Jezebel found him in that condition and asked the question that defines the abyss between the two: "Do you not now exercise kingship over Israel?" Her logic was that of Phoenician royalty, where the king was not subject to communal agrarian laws, where the property of subjects was accessible to the sovereign by force if necessary. Her response to Ahab's account was immediate and practical. "Arise, eat, and let your heart be cheerful. I will give you the vineyard of Naboth." What followed was a murderous judicial operation executed with precise bureaucracy. Jezebel wrote letters in Ahab's name, sealed with the royal seal, addressed to the elders and nobles of Jezreel. The instructions were specific. Proclaim a public fast, a ritual of communal crisis, and seat 2 men of ill repute beside Naboth during the assembly of the people to accuse him of having cursed God and the king. The penalty for blasphemy was stoning. The false accusation, supported by 2 witnesses, as the law of Israel itself required, made the execution technically legal within the very system Naboth had invoked to protect his inheritance. Naboth was stoned, probably his sons as well. The text of 2 Kings chapter 9 verse 26 mentions the blood of Naboth's sons in the same field. When the news reached the palace, Jezebel informed Ahab that the vineyard was free to be taken. It is hard not to notice how much more disturbing this episode is than the persecution of the prophets. The persecution was, in a way, a confrontation of religious power that the reader can process as a conflict of ideological systems. The case of Naboth is something else. It is an ordinary man without religious or political standing, destroyed by royal decree because he had a vineyard in the wrong place, because he said no to a request from the palace with perfect legal and theological backing. It is the demonstration that Jezebel's power was not limited by law, by custom, by faith, or by compassion. It was unlimited, and when power has no limit, The only answer that remains is the judgment that comes from outside the system it dominates. It was over Naboth's vineyard that Elijah received the most direct and most specific word that the text records against her. When Ahab went down to take possession of the vineyard, Elijah appeared. The king said, "You have found me, my enemy." Elijah responded with the sentence that would define the next 40 years. In the same place where the dogs licked Naboth's blood, they would lick Ahab's blood. And as for Jezebel, the dogs would eat her within the walls of Jezreel. 1 Kings chapter 21, verse 23. The prophecy was not vague. It had an address. It had a city. It had a specific and verifiable image. Ahab died as had been predicted. An arrow fired apparently at random during the battle of Ramoth-Gilead penetrated through the joints of his armor. He remained propped up in his chariot throughout the day, bleeding slowly, and died at sunset. When they washed the chariot at the pool of Samaria, the dogs licked the blood, as had been announced. The first part of the prophecy had been fulfilled with a geographical and circumstantial fidelity that the text itself records without additional commentary, as if the fulfillment were eloquent enough on its own. But Jezebel was alive, and she remained in power. This is something that a superficial reading of the narrative frequently compresses, jumping from one event to the next as if they were consecutive. Between Ahab's death and Jezebel's death, approximately 12 years passed. She survived her husband, exercised influence over the reign of her son Ahaziah, and then over the reign of Joram. 2 reigns under her shadow. During these years, the formal title she likely held was that of Queen Mother, Gebirah in Hebrew, a title that in the ancient Middle Eastern world conferred real political authority, not merely ceremonial. The Gebirah was consulted, had direct access to the throne, influenced state decisions. She was not a decorative figure. She was power. And Jezebel, who had exercised power alongside her husband for 22 years, was certainly not willing to become decoration after he died. During those years, she continued to be a real political force in Israel, which makes Elijah's prophecy all the more unsettling for anyone following it in real time. The words had been spoken over a specific field in a specific city. The partial fulfillment had occurred with Ahab. But Jezebel remained there in the palace of Jezreel, exercising influence over 2 successors. Living with the proximity of the prophecy the way someone lives who simply does not believe it will actually apply to them. Until Jehu received his anointing. The prophet Elisha sent a young disciple to Ramoth-Gilead to anoint Jehu, commander of Israel's army, as king in secret, separated from the other officers in an inner chamber. The prophetic instruction conveyed to the future king included the explicit mission to destroy the house of Ahab and avenge the blood of the prophets and of all the servants of Yahweh at the hands of Jezebel. 2 Kings chapter 9 records that when Jehu came out of the chamber and the other officers asked what had happened with that madman, the term they used for the prophetic messenger, he was reluctant to tell. When he did, they immediately spread their cloaks under his feet on the steps and blew the trumpet. Jehu is king. What followed was one of the fastest and most violent transitions of power that biblical narrative records. Jehu led his troops toward Jezreel with the speed that the text explicitly mentions. The watchman in the city tower recognized from afar that the driving was Jehu's because he drove furiously. The phrase in Hebrew is memorable and has been preserved with precision. He drove like a madman, headlong, with a force that knew no break. 2 mounted messengers were sent to meet him and ask whether he came in peace. Both stayed behind. Joram, son of Ahab and king of Israel, went out with King Ahaziah of Judah to meet him in person. The scene that follows has a geographical detail that the text highlights with deliberate precision. They met in the field of Naboth the Jezreelite. In the same field, Joram was struck by Jehu's arrow and died. His body was thrown into that field, and Jehu explicitly invoked the prophecy to his officer Bidkar. Remember when you and I were riding together behind Ahab, and the Lord pronounced this sentence upon him. Pick him up and throw him in the field of Naboth, according to the word of the Lord. The execution of the prophecy was being recorded in real time by the very executors, with explicit reference to the original source. This was not later interpretation, it was immediate recognition. Jezebel learned what was happening. And here you arrive at the detail that has intrigued historians, readers, and scholars with equal intensity for millennia. What Jezebel did when she learned that Jehu had killed Joram and was coming to Jezreel. She painted her eyes with kohl, the black cosmetic made of antimony that women of the ancient Middle East used. This same product has been excavated from Egyptian and Assyrian tombs dating back millennia, identical in composition to what we now call eyeliner. She carefully arranged her hair. She went up to the parapet of the palace window. She did not run. She did not hide. She did not send messengers to negotiate. She did not beg for mercy. She put on the identity of queen with deliberation, every gesture an act of control over her own image, and went up to face the man who had come to kill her. When Jehu entered the city gates, she called him by name and asked a single question loaded with historical irony. Is it well, Zimri, murderer of your master? Zimri had been a general who assassinated King Elah decades earlier and lasted exactly 7 days on the throne before being destroyed by Omri, Ahab's own father, Joram's grandfather. The comparison was a calculated provocation, a final attempt to use words as a weapon to name what Jehu was doing in a way that would contaminate the narrative of his own triumph. If he was Zimri, he would be Zimri, someone who kills and lasts a week. Jehu did not answer her. He looked up at the window and asked who was on her side. 2 or 3 eunuchs looked down at him, and then came the order, throw her down, and they threw her. Her body fell from the top of the palace. Some of the blood splashed on the wall, some on the horses below. Jehu went in, ate and drank. At some point during the meal, he remembered that she was a king's daughter, and this, in the ancient world, created minimum burial obligations that transcended political hatred. He ordered that she be buried, for she was a king's daughter, in his own words as recorded in the text. The servants went to the place where she had fallen. They found only the skull, the feet, and the palms of the hands. The dogs had eaten the rest. When the servants returned and reported to the king what remained, Jehu spoke the words that closed the cycle opened decades before by Elijah in front of the vineyard of a man unjustly killed. This is the word of the Lord that he spoke through his servant Elijah the Tishbite, saying, On the plot of ground at Jezreel, the dogs shall eat the flesh of Jezebel, and the corpse of Jezebel shall be as dung on the face of the field in the plot at Jezreel, so that no one will be able to say, This is Jezebel. The care with which the text records the 3 fragments found, not 2, not 4, exactly, the skull, the feet, and the palms, is remarkable in its specificity, as if the precision of the fulfillment demanded precision in the record, as if there were something important in what was left behind as much as in what had disappeared. Scholars of ancient Middle Eastern history have observed that dogs tend to leave extremities and skull for last, the parts with less muscle and soft tissue, therefore less palatable. Whether this technical explanation is accurate or not in the totality of its details, the fact remains. The biblical text records the correspondence between prophecy and fulfillment with a specificity that goes beyond the symbolic. It does not merely say that Jezebel died badly, it says what remained, and it places in Jehu's mouth the explicit acknowledgement that this specific outcome was the materialization of words spoken under extreme political tension. On an afternoon of conflict over a vineyard, decades earlier, Consider the scale of what this represents within biblical narrative as a whole. Elijah pronounced the prophecy at a moment of acute crisis. He had just executed the prophets of Baal at Carmel, had confronted the king over Naboth's vineyard, was in a position of political vulnerability that few prophets had faced so directly. The sentence he delivered against Jezebel had no deadline, had no condition. It was a declaration about a specific future that no human force could guarantee. Because between that moment and the fulfillment, there would be decades of unpredictable history, 2 reigns, wars, shifting political alliances, the death of Elijah himself, who would never see the end. And yet, with all that distance between the pronouncement and the fulfillment, the text records the fulfillment in the same terms as the prophecy. Jezreel, dogs, no recognizable burial, no monument, no public mourning, no place where one could point and say, "Here lies the queen." Jezebel's trajectory, seen with the distance that time offers, is the story of someone who exercised an extraordinary degree of control over nearly everything within her reach. She controlled the religious calendar of an entire kingdom for decades. She controlled the power structure around a husband who, without her, might never have reached the depth of corruption the text records. She controlled the judicial apparatus to kill a man who had the law on his side. She controlled the psychological terror over prophets who resisted her. She controlled, to a certain extent, even the moment of her own death. The choice to paint her eyes, to arrange her hair, to go up to the parapet instead of fleeing or begging. But what happened after that parapet escaped any possible control entirely, as everything she had tried to control for decades had, at some point, slipped from her hands. The prophets continued to exist when she had sworn to exterminate them. Elijah fled, but did not die when she threatened him. The drought did not yield when she wanted it to. Mount Carmel resulted in the public collapse of what she had built over years. Naboth's vineyard became the specific address of a prophecy that survived the 2 reigns she dominated after Ahab died. She chose the scene. She could not choose what the dogs would do with what remained. The woman who had spent decades rewriting the theology of Israel, reorganizing its religious structures, redefining the limits of royal power, could not rewrite her own epitaph. The name she left in history is not the name she would have chosen for herself. And the end she met is not the end that someone who painted her eyes to die, who went up to the parapet as a queen, would have planned, because the end had been written before the parapet, before the painted eyes, before the last threat sent to the prophet from Tishbe, before the first altar to Baal raised in Samaria. It had been written on the same afternoon she ordered Naboth killed for a vineyard that did not belong to her. She chose how she would die. Or at least she tried. She painted her eyes, adorned her hair, went up to the parapet. She wanted to die as a queen, not as a victim. But what happened afterward escaped her control entirely, as everything she had tried to control for decades. There was no recognizable tomb, no monument, no official mourning on record. There was a skull, 2 feet, and 2 palms of hands on the ground of Jezreel. And there were the dogs that silently completed what a prophecy had announced aloud. The woman who had tried to rewrite the religion of an entire people could not rewrite her own epitaph. That is perhaps the densest irony of her entire story. Jezebel, who controlled so much for so long, could not control even what the dogs would leave behind.